readers, welcome back to Reads with Room B. Today we will be doing chapter 11, Ramdas of A Little Princess. It will be me reading because Ash is unwell. So, let's begin. There were fine sunsets, even in the square sometimes. One could only see parts of them. However, between the chimneys and over the rooftops, from the kitchen windows one could not see them at all, and could only guess they were going on because the bricks looked warm and the air rosy or yellow for a while, or perhaps one saw a blazing glow strike a particular pane of glass somewhere. There was, however, one place which one could see all the splendor of them. The piles of red or gold clouds in the west, or purple ones edged with dazzling brightness, or little fleecy ones, floating ones, tinged with rose color and looking like flights of pink doves scurrying across the blue, in a great hurry if there was a wind. The place where one could see all this, and seemed at the same time to breathe a purer air, was of course the attic window. When the square suddenly seemed to begin to glow in an enchanted way, and looked wonderful in spite of its sooty trees and railings, Sarah knew something was going on in the sky, and when it was at all possible to leave the kitchen without being missed or called back, she invariably stole away and crept up the flights of stairs and climbed onto the old table and got her head and body as far out of the window as possible. And when she had accomplished this, she would always draw in a long breath and look all around her. It used to seem as if she had all the sky and the world to herself. No one else ever looked out of the other attics. Generally the skylights were closed, but even if they were propped open to admit air, no one seemed to come near them. And there Sarah would stand, sometimes turning her face upward to the blue, which seemed so friendly and near, just like a lovely vaulted ceiling. Sometimes, watching the west and all the wonderful things that happened there, the clouds melting or drifting or waiting softly to be changed pink or crimson or snow white or purple or pale dove gray. Sometimes they made islands or great mountains, enclosing lakes of deep turquoise blue or liquid amber or chrysoprase green. Sometimes dark headlands jutted into strange lost seas. Sometimes slender strips of wonderful lands joined other wonderful lands together. There were places where it seemed that no one could run or climb or stand and wait to see what was coming next, until perhaps it all melted and one could float away, as it seemed so to Sarah, who and nothing had ever been quite so beautiful to her as the thing she saw when she stood on the table, her body half out of the skylight, the sparrows twittering with the sunset softness on the slates. The sparrows always seemed to her to twitter with a sort of subdued softness just when these marvels were going on. There was such a sunset as this a few days after the Indian gentleman was brought to his new home, and as it is fortunately happened that the afternoon's work was done in the kitchen, and nobody had ordered her to go anywhere or perform any task, Sarah found it easier than usual to slip away and go upstairs. She mounted her table and stood looking out. It was a wonderful moment. There were floods of molten gold covering the west, as if a glorious tide was sweeping over the world. A deep, rich yellow light filled the air. The birds flying across the tops of the houses showed quite black against it. "It's a splendid one," said Sarah softly to herself. "It makes me feel almost afraid, as if something strange was just going to happen. The splendid ones always make me feel like that. And suddenly she turned her head because she heard a sound a few yards away from her. It was an odd sound, like a queer little squeaky chattering, and it came from the window of the next attic. Someone had come, just as she had, to look at the sunset. There was a head and part of a body emerging from the skylight. But it was not the head or a body of a little girl or housemaid. It was a picturesque, white form and dark-faced, gleaming-eyed, white-turbaned head of a native Indian manservant. A Lascar, Sarah said to herself quickly, and the sound she had heard came from the small monkey he held in his arms as if he were fond of it, and which was snuggling and chattering against his breast. As Sarah looked toward him, he looked toward her. The first thing she thought that was his dark face looked sorrowful and homesick. She felt absolutely sure he had come up to look at the sun, because he had so seldom seen it in England, and longed for the sight of it. She looked at him interestedly for a second, and then a smile crossed the slates. She had learned to know how comforting a smile, even from a stranger, may be. Hers was evidently a pleasure to him, and his whole expression altered, and he showed such gleaming white teeth as he smiled back that it was as if a light had illuminated his dusky face. The friendly look in Sarah's eyes was always very effective when people felt tired or dull. It was perhaps in making his salute to her that he loosened his hold on the monkey. He was an impish monkey and was always ready for adventure, and it is probable that the sight of a little girl excited him. He suddenly broke loose, jumped on the slats, and ran across them chattering, and actually leapt onto Sarah's shoulder, and from there down into her attic room. It made her laugh and delighted her, but she knew he must be restored to his master, if the Lascar was his master, and she wondered how this was to be done. Would he let her catch him, or would he be naughty and refuse to be caught, or perhaps get away and run off over the roofs and be lost? That would not do at all. Perhaps he belonged to the Indian gentleman, and the poor man was fond of him. She turned to the Lascar, feeling glad that she still remembered some of the Hindustan that she had learned when she had lived with her father. She could make the man understand, and she spoke to him in a language he knew. "Will he let me catch him?" she asked. She thought she had never seen more surprise and delight in the dark face expressed when she spoke the familiar tongue. The truth was, the poor fellow felt as if his gods had intervened, and the little kind voice came from heaven itself. At once, Sarah saw that he had been accustomed to European children. He poured forth a respectful flood of thanks. He was a servant of Miss Sahib. The monkey was a good monkey and would not bite, but unfortunately he was difficult to catch. He would flee from one spot to another, like lightning. He was disobedient, though not evil. Ramdas knew him as if he were his child, and Ramdas he would sometimes obey, but not always. If Miss Sahib would permit Ramdas, he would himself cross the roof to her room, enter the window, and regain the unworthy little animal. But evidently he was afraid Sarah might think he was taking great liberties, and perhaps not let him come. But Sarah gave him leave at once. "Can you get across?" she inquired. "In a moment," he answered her. "Then come," she said. "He is flying from side to side of the room, as if he is frightened." Ramdas slipped through his attic window and crossed to hers as steadily and as lightly as if he had been walking on roofs all his life. He slipped through the skylight and dropped upon his feet without so much as a sound. Then he turned to Sarah and salaamed again. The monkey saw him and uttered a little scream. Ramdas hastily took the precaution of shutting the skylight, and then went in chase of him. It was not a very long chase. The monkey prolonged it a few minutes, evidently for the mere fun of it. But presently he sprang chattering to Ramdas's shoulder, and there sat chattering and clinging to his neck with a very weird little skinny arm. Ramdas thanked Sarah profoundly. She had seen that his quick native eyes had taken in at a glance all the bare shabbiness of the room, but he spoke to her as if he were speaking to the little daughter of the Raj, and pretended that he observed nothing. He did not presume to remain more than a few minutes after he caught the little monkey, for in those moments he was given to further deep thought and grateful obeisance to her in return for her indulgence. This little evil one, he said, stroking the monkey, was in truth not so evil as he seemed, and his master, who was ill, was sometimes amused by him. He would have been sad if his favourite had run away and been lost. Then he salaamed once more, got through the skylight, and crossed the slates again with as much agility as the monkey himself had displayed. When he had gone, Sarah stood in the middle of her attic and thought of many things his face and his manner brought back to her. The sight of his native costume and his profound reverence of his manner stirred all her past memories, and it seemed a strange thing to remember that she, the drudge whom the cook had said insulting things to an hour ago, had only a few years ago been surrounded by people who treated her as Ramdas had treated her, who salaamed when she went by, whose foreheads almost touched the ground when she had spoken to them, who were her servants and her slaves. It was like some sort of dream. It was all over, and it could never come back. It certainly seemed that there was no way in which any change could take place. She knew what Miss Minchin intended that her future should be. So long as she was too young to be used as a regular teacher, she would be used as an errand girl and servant, and yet expected to remember what she had learned, and in some mysterious way to learn more. The greater number of her evenings she was supposed to spend at study, and at various indefinite intervals she was examined, and she knew she would have been severely admonished if she had not advanced, as was expected of her. The truth, indeed, was that Miss Minchin knew that she was too anxious to learn to require teachers. To give her books and she would devour them, and by the end, knowing them by heart, she might be trusted to be equal to teaching a good deal in the course of a few years. And this is what would happen. When she was older, she would be expected to drudge in the schoolroom, as she drudged now in various parts of the house. They would be obliged to give her more respectable clothes, of course, but these would be sure to be plain and ugly, and make her look somehow like a servant. That was all there seemed to be to look forward to, and Sarah stood quite still for some minutes and thought it over. And then a thought came back to her, which made the color rise in her cheek and sparked light itself in her eyes. She straightened her thin little body and lifted her head. "Whatever comes," she said, "cannot alter one thing. If I am to be a princess in rags and tatters, I can be a princess inside. It would be easy to be a princess if I were dressed in cloth of gold, but it is said to be a great deal more triumph to be one in times when no one knows it. There was Marie Antoinette when she was in prison, and her throne was gone, and she had only a black gown on, and her hair was white, and they insulted her and called her the Widow Capet. She was a great deal more like a queen then than she was when she was so gay and everything was so grand. I liked her best then. Those howling mobs of people did not frighten her. She was stronger than they were, even when they cut off her head. This was not a new thought, but a quite old one by this time. It had consoled her through many a bitterer day, and she had gone about the house with an expression in her face which Miss Minchin could not understand, and which was the source of a great annoyance to her, as it seemed as if the child were mentally living a life which held her above the rest of the world. It was as if she scarcely heard the rude and acid things said to her, or if she heard them, she did not care for them at all. Sometimes, when she was in the midst of some harsh, domineering speech, Miss Minchin would find the still, unchildish eyes fixed upon her with something like a proud smile in them. At such times, she did not know what Sarah was saying to herself. You don't know that you are saying these things to a princess, and that if I chose, I could wave my hand and order your execution. I only spare you because I am a princess, and you are a poor, stupid, unkind, vulgar old thing, and you do not know any better. This used to interest and amuse her more than anything else, and the queer and fanciful as it was, she found comfort in it, and it was a good thing for her. While the thought held possession of her, she could not be made to be rude or malicious by the rudeness and malice of those about her. A princess must be polite, she said to herself, and so when the servants, taking their tone from their mistress, were insolent and ordered her about, she would hold her head erect and reply to them with quaint civility, which often made them stare at her. She's got more airs and graces than if she'd come from Buckingham Palace, that young one, said the cook, clucking a little sometimes. I lose my temper with her often enough, but I will say she never forgets her manners. If you please, cook. Will you be so kind, cook? I beg your pardon, cook. May I trouble you, cook? She drops them about the kitchen as if they was nothing. The morning after her interview with Ramdass and his monkey, Sarah was in the schoolroom with her small pupils. Having finished giving them their lesson, she was putting the French exercise books together and thinking, as she did it, of the various things the royal personages in disguise were called upon to do. Alfred the Great, for instance, burning the cakes and getting his ears boxed by the wife of the neatherd. How frightened she must have been when she found out what she had done. If Miss Minchin should find out that she, Sarah, whose toes were almost sticking out of her boots, was a princess, a real one, the look in her eyes was exactly which Miss Minchin disliked. She would not have liked it. She was quite near her and was so enraged that she actually flew at her and boxed her ears, exactly as Neatherd's wife had boxed King Alfred's, and it made Sarah start. She awakened from her dream at the shock, and catching her breath, stood still a second. Then, not knowing she was going to do it, she broke into a little laugh. "What are you laughing at, you bold, impudent child?" exclaimed Miss Minchin. It took Sarah a few moments to control herself sufficiently to remember that she was a princess. Her cheeks were red and smarting from the blows she had received. "I was thinking," she answered. "Beg my pardon immediately," said Miss Minchin. Sarah hesitated a second before she replied, "I will beg your pardon for laughing, if it was rude," she said then, "but I won't beg your pardon for thinking." "What were you thinking?" demanded Miss Minchin. "How dare you think? What were you thinking?" Jessie tittered, and she and Lavinia nudged each other in unison, and all the girls looked up at their books to listen. Really, it always interested them a little when Miss Minchin attacked Sarah. Sarah always said something queer, and never seemed the least bit frightened. She was not the least frightened now, though her boxed ears were scarlet, and her eyes were as bright as stars. "I was thinking," she answered grandly and politely, "that you did not know what you were doing. That I did not know what I was doing? Miss Minchin fairly gasped. Yes, said Sarah. And I was thinking what would happen if I were a princess and you boxed my ears, and what I should do to you. And I was thinking that if I were one, you would never dare do it, whatever I said or did. And I was thinking how surprised and frightened you would be if you suddenly found out. And she imagined the future so clearly before her eyes that she spoke in a manner which had an effect upon Miss Minchin. It almost seemed for a moment to her narrow, unimaginative mind that there must be some real power hidden behind this candid darling. What? She found out. Found out what? That I really was a princess, said Sarah, and could do anything I liked. Go to your room, cried Miss Minchin breathlessly. This instant. Leave the schoolroom. Attend to your lessons now, young ladies. Sarah made a little bow. Excuse me for laughing if I was impolite, she said, and walked out of the room, leaving Miss Minchin struggling with her rage, and the girls whispering over their books. Did you see her? Do you see how queer she looked? Jessie broke out. I shouldn't be at all surprised if she did turn out to be something. Suppose she should. And that is the end of our chapter. Be kind, stay excellent, and see you next time, readers. Bye!